Today we will be interviewing Michael Miller. Thank you so much for being here. Michael Miller is the Chief of Strategic Initiatives at Acton Institute. And we know him in Guatemala for hosting the Poverty Cure series. And we're very excited he decided to come to Guatemala, and we're very, very honored to have him here at Instituto Fe y Libertad. Michael received his bachelor's degree from the University of Notre Dame, an MA from Nagoya University's Graduate School of International Development in Japan, an MA in philosophy from Franciscan University, and an MBA in international management from Thunderbird Graduate School of Global Business. So a lot of degrees, and you have lived in Europe, Asia, Africa, and Latin America. And he lectures internationally on many different topics, including moral philosophy, economic development, social theory, and entrepreneurship. And before coming to Acton, you spent 3 years at Ave Maria College in the Americas in Nicaragua, where you taught philosophy and political science, and you were the chair of philosophy and theology department. Mm-hmm. So today we want to pick your brain on more or less on these topics, on ethics.
The very hard ones.
And doing the right thing. Because here at Instituto Fe y Libertad, we want to be able to communicate ethical concerns or principles or raise ethical questions to some of our audience. And I think we live in very confusing times. There's fake news, censorship, libel, lying politicians, mandatory vaccination, human and drug trafficking, abortion, euthanasia, gender ideology, and many other topics that really breed conflict and raise questions about what is right. And so I guess the first question would be, has the world lost its moral compass?
Well, that's a hard question. I mean, I think in one sense, the world's always struggling to keep its moral compass and losing its moral compass. And I think this is a fundamentally a human problem. I think some ages are more difficult than others. I think we're if we look back at some ancient civilizations, ancient periods of time, things were very rough. There was abortion and euthanasia and murder and gladiatorial matches, and so these were very, very rough times. People did not have justice. The idea of human rights had not spread from the Jewish and Christian tradition into the West the way it is now. So even some of the secular concerns with human rights actually come out of the Hebrew Bible, right? And so in one sense, this is, I think, the way of man. I mean, you read the book of Genesis. We see a murder and rape and brutality. And so this is, I think, a constant struggle. I think one of the challenges we have now, you brought up just fake news and media. I mean, I think the fact of modern technology and immediacy of information is a big challenge. And I think there's two other big challenges. One is this prevalence of relativism. That is, that there is no truth and the truth can't be known. In some ways, relativism was always that only maybe a small section of maybe a couple of elites, right? When relativism spreads down to everyone, it creates a brutal society, and people don't know how to navigate. And so I think a big problem is that the former Pope Benedict XVI, before he was elected Pope, he gave a very famous homily where he talked about, he said, we live in a difficult time where everything's kind of moving and flexible, not flexible, but volatile, like you described. And he said, we live in a dictatorship of relativism. Mm-hmm. And that was, I think, surprising to people. Like, wait a minute, dictatorship of relativism, isn't absolute truth the dictator? Doesn't relativism mean we're free? And what Ratzinger, later Benedict XVI, was pointing out is something very, very important that I think it sounds maybe philosophical, right? It sounds like, we have to do philosophy, but it really is very, very important in these very practical questions. And that when relativism becomes dominant, it can only be a dictatorship, because relativism means there is no truth. And if I have no truth, if we don't have access to truth, if there is no truth or we can't know the truth, then truth gets determined by power. And whoever has power determines what the case is. And that means injustice can reign. And so truth and justice are deeply connected. And so the existence of truth and the ability to know truth doesn't mean we necessarily do, but it now opens us up to the ability to have a discussion about what is right and what is wrong. And we see this as far back as Antigone, right? In the story of Antigone, where Antigone wants to bury her brother, and the king says, you can't bury your brother. And she says, no, there's a law above you, right? And that I think every human being knows, and this becomes a real question. So I think the challenge we have now is not that human nature has changed. There's always evil in the world, but that our intellect, we think we're very intellectually sophisticated, but in fact, we're actually quite intellectually like basic and with lots of errors, because we don't take truth seriously. And I think that creates just the problem, all the fake news, power, euthanasia, all those things are because we've denied truth.
Yeah, you have often said that some people do not like the idea of moral truth in particular, because truth makes demands on them. Yeah. I found that very powerful when I first heard you say that. And can you explain this idea or give us an example?
Sure. I mean, I think I would say not some people, all people, including me. We don't like the truth. You know, there's a saying we say, the truth hurts. And there's the truth hurts. And the truth also sets us free and heals us. But just like medicine, sometimes a surgery can hurt us in order to heal us. Truth also hurts in order to heal us. And what I mean by that is that if there's an objective experience of something being like wrong, right, or just, if I've done something to harm you and I'm blind to that fact, and someone else says like, Michael, you this is what you did, this is why it's wrong, and here it is. And I say, well, that's just your opinion. I can do whatever I want. In one sense, I'm protected. I can just justify myself all the time. And but once I accept that truth exists and it can be known and that I might be wrong, that means that my will, my desires are not the determining factor of reality. And so, you know, the philosopher says that man is the measure of all things. And Plato says, no, man is not the measure of all things. God is the measure of things. And so if truth is the measure, then I'm not the measure. And if I'm not the measure, my will must submit to something outside of me. And I don't want to do that because I want to do what I want to do. And I want to justify that. And the existence of truth says, you're not the center of the universe. And we all want to be the center of the universe. But as we know, when that makes us all little dictators. And lots of little dictators just creates a life that's nasty, brutish, and short. And it doesn't allow for human flourishing. It doesn't allow for love and for sacrifice. And all the fundamental things that we actually do value, love, beauty, goodness, truth, mercy, compassion, forgiveness, hope, all of those things mean nothing if there's no truth. And I'm simply, my will is the center. And now it's just a battle of powerful wills. And that creates injustice. It creates injustice for the poor, for the weak, for women, and for children. And that's a bad place to live. And so the challenge is this. We either submit ourselves to the truth and take justice and friendship and life and beauty and goodness seriously. And that means we have to admit our faults. Or we try to make ourselves dictators, and we create disorder and disharmony and unhappiness and early death. So it's a trade-off.
Sounds like you're describing Twitter.
Exactly. Twitter's Hobbesian, nasty, brutish, and short.
But if you open up to truth and you open up to others, and I think you're right, existence is much more pleasant if we accept the truth and objective parameters to get along.
And I just want to say, it's not only, sometimes the truth hurts, so it doesn't make it immediately pleasant. But I don't think pleasantness is the model. I think it's because it's real. Okay. And reality, so I sometimes explain it this way, like to bring religion in for a minute. I sometimes would teach philosophy to undergraduates, and we'd talk about like 10 commandments. And I would say, well, you don't really break the commandments as much as you break yourself against the commandments, because it's not just practical. You're dealing with reality. So I can deny truth, and I can step out into the street in front of a bus, but I'm going to get hit by the bus, right? and so it's not simply because it's more useful, but because it is actually reality that matters. And then when we have that, now we can actually say, okay, now let's debate on what's right, what's wrong, what's just, how's the best way to help the poor, how's the best way to do this, how should I treat my neighbor? And until you have that depth of like realization of reality and truth, you can't even do it. And the last thing I'll say is that this is not original in me. I mean, this is ancient, but I think C.S. Lewis is very good at this. Nobody lives like a relativist. Mm-hmm. They only live like a relativist. We only want to be relativists when it benefits us, right? But if you're doing something that I think is unjust, I'll say, that's not fair.
Right.
Okay, well, why is fair better than not fair? Right? Why is justice better than not justice? Why is goodness better than not goodness? Well, now we have to go into, we have to take these things seriously. So that's I think, the intellectual error that's just in the air. Mm-hmm. And you see it from, high school students all the way up to, presidents. It's the intellectual error. And that's what's, I think, making life so coarse right now.
So tell me about justice then, because that's sort of the social aspect of
sure.
We have a moral compass, we have truth that sort of leads us to talk about how we can treat each other fairly or with justice.
Yeah. So, I mean, justice, of course, is the real question, right? I think, in a sense, I mentioned Antigone. It's in the Hebrew Bible. I mean, Plato, Aristotle, all cultures, everybody's trying to wrestle with this question of what's fair, what's just, and so the classical definition of justice is that you give each person what's due to them. So then you have to ask, okay, well, what determines what's due to them? Mm. And so Plato asks. There's this debate in the Republic, Socrates asking Thrasymachus, "What's justice?" And Thrasymachus says, justice is just the rule of the stronger, right? And I think it's Polemarchus says, justice is rewarding your friends and punishing your enemies, right? And people are unsatisfied. That just doesn't seem to work, right? And so these are, in a sense, profound questions. And so like everything, it's complex. But I think there are ways to navigate through it. And I think, so a couple things we need to think about. So what does it mean to give each person their due? And there are elements to this. I think one of the elements is what's called legal justice, where there's the question of rule of law. So justice means, in law, that everyone is treated equally. Mm-hmm. Now, this actually comes out of the Hebrew Bible. In Leviticus 19:16, I think it is, says, there should never be partiality in justice. You don't treat some people better because they're rich. You don't treat some people better because they're poor. You treat everybody the same. And today, we have two kinds of, I think, big injustice in that area. We have either cronyism, crony capitalism, special treatment for the rich and well-connected, or we have this social justice view that says we're going to treat the oppressed with special care. And both of those are violations of justice because they're partial in the wrong sense of partial, right? So the general understanding of justice in say the Western tradition is that we should treat everyone as if they're the same. They don't give special privileges, and now you can analyze the case, right? Mm-hmm. So that's the first part of legal justice. And then there's commutative justice. So commutative justice is a big word, but it means justice of exchange. So I'm going to buy the piece of paper and clipboard for you, and I'll give you $5, and we make a justice, okay? And that's a justice of exchange. Now, there's a couple things that are important. If you're starving, and that's worth $100, and I say, I'll give you $2, I'm taking advantage of you, and that would be an act of injustice. It would not be commutative exchange, right? Mm-hmm. 2, if I had a gun to your head and said, you're going to sell that to me for $2, that's not justice because there's coercion. Now, there could be profit. You could have made it for $4, but I think it's worth $10, and the profit's fine, okay? But there has to be there's a commutative justice of exchange. And that is important for the marketplace. So you really want justice. You want legal justice, So like if a poor person goes into, right, they want to be able to have contracts and not, oh, well, my brother-in-law is the judge. And so, no, it has to be fair. And then there has to be justice of exchange. Then there's another kind of justice called distributive justice. And distributive justice is like in the family. So I have a 9-year-old daughter, and she's amazing. She can find absolutely everything. So if I need, like, where are my shoes? Where are my keys? Where's my tennis racket? Well, one day I said, can you find this book? And she said, no. And so I gave her no dinner. Okay. And right now you laugh or you think, wow, he's terrible. Because immediately we sense that's unjust, right? Distributive justice means that my job is to go make money and then distribute to my children. I don't treat my children in a commutative justice relationship. That's market justice. Family justice is different. Well, but if you use, but you can also use distributive justice where there should be market justice. If we give everything to the poor, but we don't allow them to participate in the economy, we can think we're being just. Oh, here's my stuff. But we're actually being unjust because we're excluding them from participation. So I know that was a lot, but I think this is very important for business people and for think like sometimes business people can become so utilitarian that they start applying commutative justice to the family. Like, no, that's not commutative justice. Or sometimes religious people can think, oh, I'm so into distributive justice, they want to apply distributive justice where there should be to the market. And St. Thomas Aquinas has a wonderful line that he said, injustice can occur in two ways. One, from the violent act of the man who possesses power, which we all understand. And two, from the false prudence of the sage, which is the policymaker who misapplies justice and keeps poor people excluded. I know that's a long question, but I think these things are, so it sounds academic, and I'll finish here, but they actually have real life application. And if we get justice right, we can create a society that won't be perfect. We can never create a perfect society because we're not perfect. But we can actually help create conditions where people can flourish. And this is why truth matters. It's why reason matters. It's why justice matters, and why the dignity of the person matters.
What you were mentioning, legal justice, I was thinking, well, sometimes it gets confusing because there are some things that are legal that are probably not very ethical,
right.
And there might be some morality that is not legislated. And,
yes, yeah.
For example, Martin Luther King said that oppressive laws are trumped by divine and natural law, right?
Yeah. He quotes Augustine and Aquinas in his letter from the Birmingham jail. It's very good.
So, prostitution has been legalized in 15 countries, for example. So there you have an example of something that is unethical that's been legalized. How often have you heard in a sort of mocking tone that you can't legalize morality?
Yeah.
And how do you go about reconciling, ethics and the law?
So this is like both a very hard question and a very easy question.
Okay.
So the easy part is this. You'll hear people say, and you hear people from the right and the left, libertarians, progressives, like, you can't legislate morality. Well, the answer is that's the most ridiculous thing I've ever heard, because law is the legislation of morality. That's what law is. And I don't mean that, I know that sounds harsh when I say it's ridiculous, but like once we think about it for a second, that's what law is. Right? So why can you not steal somebody's goods and it's in the law? Well, you're legislating morality, right? Law is the legislation of morality at its foundational element. Now, not every law is necessarily legislating a deep moral question. Should you drive 35 miles an hour or 40 miles an hour? No, okay? But that you don't just drive 100 miles an hour through a neighborhood is the legislation of morality, that that life is good and that we should respect and not kill little children playing in the street. Okay, so law, that's the easy part. Okay, it sounds like, and I say it's easy because with just a couple minutes of thought, you're like, oh, of course, law is the legislation of morality. Now the hard part is, there's law. There are laws that make something legal that is immoral. Okay, so abortion is the intentional killing of an unborn child, is an immoral act. It's an intrinsic evil to kill an innocent person. Putting Jewish people in concentration camps is an intrinsic evil. It doesn't matter that the Nazis made it legal or not. Okay, it's an intrinsic evil. So, and this is what Martin Luther King was pointing out. The laws that were racist and excluding African Americans from participation in social and political life, it didn't matter that they were in the books. They were unjust. And so as Martin Luther King argued, and others, an unjust law is not a law, because a law has to be directed towards justice. So that's one problem. The other problem is, especially like in the West, America, I think even more so, the United States, even more so, but throughout the Latin America and Europe, I think we're confused. We think if it's legal, it's moral. And that's false, right? And we can see that with some things, but we can't see it with others. But so the law needs to be reasonable, and it needs to be a reflection of justice. Now, the other side's another question is, not everything that is immoral should be made illegal. Okay, so I mentioned I have like children, okay? And so children don't always tell the truth. And so it's my job as their father to say, to tell them, you have to tell the truth. And I may have to punish them, or et cetera. But we can't have the police come because they said, did you take the candy? I did not take the candy. Like, right? Not everything should be illegal. And like St. Thomas Aquinas talks about this as well. Like, this is a bit earthy, but the Catholic Church teaches that you should not have sexual relations until you're married. But it would be wrong for the state to outlaw that. Why? Because it would give the state so much power. They're knocking on your door all the time, right? That creates a totalitarian state. It would create a totalitarian state to make every lie illegal
by law.
Right. But perjury, when you lie in a court, okay, now that's illegal, right? And so law and morality are deeply connected, but it takes prudence of the legislators to make sure that not everything that is illegal, that is immoral should be illegal, and to never make something that's intrinsically evil legal. Right? Because, and that's where the tension goes. But again, that requires us to think about justice, to make distinctions, and that's very hard in a culture of relativism and propaganda.
And Martin Luther King's statement sort of set the foundations for civil disobedience. There are occasions when, as citizens, we can go against what the law prescribes. And I don't know if it shocked you, but it shocked a lot of people here in Guatemala and Latin America to see what happened during the pandemic with the riots instigated by Black Lives Matter and some other organizations, where they were vandalizing private property and burning buildings and bringing down statues. And they did this in the name of racial equality and
justice.
And they sort of seem to take the civil disobedience discourse of Martin Luther King to a place where, for me at least, it didn't belong. They went beyond the limit. I don't know if
I think
you agree.
So, well, I do actually. So I think civil disobedience is a very important thing. So St. Thomas Aquinas, and again, Martin Luther King quotes Aquinas and Augustine. Aquinas makes some important distinctions that I think are helpful here. And again, King is writing in that tradition, so that's why I'm connecting them together. That there are good laws and bad laws. There are just laws and unjust laws. And in one sense, an unjust law is not a law at all. So what Aquinas says, and then I'll get to the United States tradition, is if there's a law that's bad and it's fundamentally unjust and prescribing that you do evil, you must disobey. Right? So if you have to do something that's intrinsically evil, you say, I cannot do it. And if that requires you to go to prison or be executed, then you must obey God rather than man. And Benedict XVI has a beautiful line. He said, in the totalitarian regimes of the 20th century that completely rejected justice and reason, they rejected reason, truth, and justice, and it was just pure power. He said it was the testimony of the martyrs who stood up to the lies and would rather die than comply that helped convalesce reason, helped heal reason, and of course truth and justice. So you can never obey a fundamentally unjust law. Then there's a second type of law that is bad and unjust, but maybe not intrinsically evil or like a little bit on a lower element. And what Aquinas says there is that you should obey the law and work to get it changed.
Right.
Because if you just immediately disobey every law you don't like, it's too easy for us to say, well, I just don't like that law. Well, maybe it's not, you don't like it. Maybe it's a bad law, but it doesn't mean it's intrinsically evil, okay? And even if it's not good, it's still a problem. So how you disobey and then you work to get it changed. Then there's a question of civil disobedience. So the laws against African Americans under Jim Crow were unjust. They were unjust laws. And so in the U.S. tradition and this Catholic tradition, there's a way where you disobey the laws, but you don't disobey them. You don't disobey them kind of how do you say, like, just kind of radical disobedience. It's focused, very focused, kind of prudential disobedience. So Martin Luther King, Malcolm X, others, and this is a tradition outside of the United States, say, I will not comply. So Rosa Parks sat in a bus. She's like, I will not comply because the law was unjust. It was wrong. And so she didn't comply. And when you don't comply, you then start the legal system to work because now you've broken the law. But you've broken the law, and now you have to do it. And the point is, by breaking the law, you're going to challenge the law to change the law. And so what happened in the riots were, I think, partially the fact that there were lockdowns in the United States and people had been put in their houses too long. But what happened in the riots is you had this radical protests. Now, there are reasons for some of the protests, okay? But instead of protesting to try to get the laws changed and try to get justice for say, in the George Floyd case, what happened is they became essentially the radical movement where injustice was done in the name of getting justice. And that's always an error. You can't do an evil to obtain a good. So breaking down and destroying innocent people's businesses is not an act of civil disobedience. It's an act of injustice to others. Right. And so the whole point of the argument, right, was an injustice has occurred. We need to make sure we redress this and get justice for the people involved. And instead of doing that, they went out and did not everybody, okay, mind you, not everybody, but certain groups of them went and committed other injustices. And so, I mean, so the Black Lives Matter thing is like very complex, right? So I mean, because there's multiple, and I'm not an expert in this, but there's multiple levels of what Black Lives Matter means. And then there's the Black Lives Matter organization, which was essentially a Marxist organization that wants to, get rid of the traditional family and et cetera, and all those. So there's that. And then there were lots of people who were rightfully upset at injustice, right, or police brutality and things. And so a lot of the people who were, I think, protesting just went out to make a claim that they thought that justice needed to be addressed. But there were groups that, and this was the surprising part, that actually engaged in real injustice. They themselves engaged in injustice against others. And you don't heal a society and get justice by doing injustice. What you do is you create even more problems. And a friend of mine makes this point. This is the problem with Twitter, is justice requires us to have prudence. So remember that the 4 cardinal virtues are justice, prudence, courage, and temperance. And they all work together. And prudence is seeing the world as it is and acting accordingly. And temperance is moderation. And if you're going to do just get justice right, you have to see the world as it is, moderately think and analyze. And that's hard, okay? And when you're in a mob, it's very hard. When you're looking at Twitter, when you're being propagandized constantly by social media, and you, by the way, this is not just protesters during the pandemic, and this is serious, Catholic scholars on Twitter will start to lose their mind because in order to do justice well, you have to be prudent and dispassionate. The passions create make us make errors. And so like Aquinas, St. Thomas Aquinas, who was not a pacifist, and he argued there's times for war and just war, but also warned, you really want to avoid war as much as possible because people will do things in war that they never would have done in another period of time. And so what we're seeing with like protests and mobs and you see this all over the world now, and social media and all of the things, is that we're, in a sense, our passions are hyper excited and our reason is decreased. And going back to the beginning of our discussion, even our categories of relativism and how we think. So we have like real intellectual errors and conceptual errors mixed with propaganda, social media, and then passions. And some of the passions are correct. Like there should not be injustice. Those things get together, and what happens is bad things happen that shouldn't. And this is, it's a human challenge. We're not the only time period to deal with it. And it's easy for us to have this conversation here in this very nice room, calmly. But if you or I were on the streets and we felt injustice that had happened, it's how kind of controlled and philosophical it would be. And this is why it's very important, I think, to always have a certain sense of humility and then a submission, as it were, to the truth, because each one of us could easily start throwing bricks through windows, right? And to realize like that's not just other people, that I can do that too. And so I think these are hard questions, and there may be people listening to this who halfway think, "Oh, I'm the worst person ever." They're listening to me, but and this is because we have to be able to work through complex and make distinctions. And justice requires distinctions. Justice requires us making real, serious distinctions on intent, situation, context, etc. And if we're so passionate that we can't make distinctions, we often create more injustice.
More injustice.
So may we always have to do justice in a very calm place like this, and be spared the difficulty of being in place. And that's why Martin Luther King was so impressive.
Thinking about things ahead of time, not when you are faced with the crisis or the challenge, and not where you're in a mob situation, but having given thought to these things. I think that's why it's important to bring back the discussion on ethics and
I think, and that's why I think Martin Luther King, he had a broad corpus, and people can agree or disagree with various parts, but I think he was very impressive because he, in the midst of real injustice, he was the voice of justice and of moderation, and really I think a model in that way. And you see this with some of the other great dissident leaders, not only in the United States but other places, who stood up to the truth and could have incited violence but didn't. Because Martin Luther King could have incited incredible violence. He had a lot of power, and he didn't. He held it back. And I think that too is a very admirable thing. I hope I would be able to do that. But when you have a lot of power, you can incite violence. To not do it is a sign, I think, of a great leader.
So I guess the question now would be, how do we go about teaching ethics in this time and age? What can Instituto Fe y Libertad do to increase people's understanding of truth and ethics and morality and prudence?
These are difficult questions. I mean, this was a question of like Aristotle, I think, asked, can you teach virtue, right? And I think the first teaching, of course, is just in our own lives, we try to do the best we can to live according to truth and an ethical, moral life, to ask forgiveness when we make error, to change our ways as much as we can. I think the first thing is each of us tries to do the best we can, and then to admit our faults and correct them as much as we can, and continue to do that. I think, then in the teaching of ethics, I think the part of the beginning is we have to do some basic philosophy on, does truth exist and can you know it? Does the law of non-contradiction hold? So this is Aristotle's Metaphysics, Book 4. Can two things be the same in the same way at the same time? And he says, no, they can't. Okay, well, then to as you said, think about these questions of justice, walk through them, and wrestle with them, so that we do have the habits of mind to make distinctions. But also that we practice virtue, because it's very easy to talk about being good. It's much harder to be good. So we have to just practice virtue. And I think that virtue is done in community. It's done in families. It's done in other people who want to be good. And you work together. You hold one another accountable. And we don't create virtuous, moral people in an ethics classroom. But I do think there's a place for sound teaching. And I think back to this point of the dictatorship of relativism, we have to escape the hall of mirrors of materialism and relativism and radical empiricism, because all of those things lead us down into the depths where justice is simply the rule of the stronger, and I am the measure of all things. And if we're all living as the radical measure of the world, we have nasty, British, and short life. So I think I don't think there's one way. But I think fundamentally it's the family and parents and children all trying to live together in harmony, saying you're sorry, doing your best, and then making distinctions. I don't know if that's a very good answer. If I had a better answer, I don't know. Maybe I'd be rich. But that's what I guess I'll have to think about it more. It's because it's a very good question.
Well, thank you so much. I think we scratched the surface of this topic.
Hard.
Yes, but.
We'll probably make some people mad, some
light.
people happy.
I think you shed some light on this controversial topic and have guided us for future exploration. So
thank you very much.
Thank you very much for granting us this interview.
Thank you.
For more information regarding Instituto Fe y Libertad, its work, activities, and what was discussed in this episode, you can visit feylibertad.org. and our sites on Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, Instagram, and YouTube. Thank you very much for joining us.